report from select committees.
Report from select committees.
Reports from select committees.
Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. You would recall, Mr. President, that sometime in February this year, this Honourable Senate passed a resolution that the bills, on the Cybercrime Bill 2024 and the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill 2024 be referred to the Joint Select Committee standing on governance and policy matters. Since then, that committee has been meeting and doing its work and has finally concluded that work. And I have been requested on behalf of the chairman and members of that committee to present the report on the committee's deliberations. And I therefore now present this report to this Honourable Senate.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. And I would want to, on behalf of the Honourable Senators, to thank you and Senator Nichols and any other members from this chamber who were on the committee for the work that you did. I can see based on the printed volume that it is a quite sizable volume of work, and we will, I'm sure, have the opportunity to consider it in due course. Thank you very much for the hard work put into the deliberations and the results therefrom.
Resume.
Public business resumed.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill. I'm sorry. Number 3, sir. Bits. Previous, sir. Apologies. I'll read it again. Order number 3, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Marine Transport Emissions Control Bill 2024.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I wish, before I get into the meat of my presentation, to join you and Senator Boyce, who spoke earlier today, in extending condolences on the passing of our own former Deputy President, the Honourable Cappy Greenwich. I had the privilege of serving in this Honourable Chamber for the duration of my term so far in the Senate, and it was his leadership as the Deputy President at the time that I think in many instances, at a time where the Senate was perhaps a lot of times very energized by some of the contributions by some of the members, we were always graced by Cappy, as we called him, Cappy's calm, purposeful, always gracious demeanor, and we will very much miss him as we go forward. Mr. President, today I am presenting on the Marine Transport Emissions Control Suite of Laws, and I want to focus our attention. It is a considerable bill. It has been on the order paper for an extended period of time, so I am confident that we have all had an opportunity to review the bill. When we met some time ago, we did discuss the Marine Transport Bill, which carries some of the relevant elements that will be covered here today. Mr. President, I will, in the course of my presentation, speak about the entity that is responsible for anchoring this suite of legislation, what the global rules have been prior to these amendments, and also, Mr. President, what has precipitated them taking root in countries like ours around the world. And then, Mr. President, I want to spend some time in particular, given, of course, that I used to be Minister with responsibility for international transport, and so I do have some knowledge of where this originated, and much of that work would have started even before I was the minister. It would have started when there was a Ministry of Blue Economy and Maritime Affairs under the Honourable Kirk Humphrey. It would have continued under my role as International Transport Minister, and even now it continues under the current Minister with responsibility for international transport. So I will speak about that from that perspective, Mr. President, but I will, of course, also draw some attention to Part 4 of the legislation, which speaks to energy efficiency for ships, given my current role as Minister of Energy. So, Mr. President, this legislation and this conversation has been couched very much within the context of climate change, climate resilience, the need for countries and industry to work collaboratively under a global framework to be able to reduce the impact of ships' emissions, carbon emissions, to reduce the impact of carbon and greenhouse gases on our environment, and to ensure that there is a regulatory framework that puts in place the necessary requirements for us to achieve those objectives, the objectives of reducing and mitigating greenhouse gases. Now, Mr. President, I don't think that I need, at this stage, to speak about what climate change is. I don't think that I need, at this stage, to go over why Barbados has put its brand behind the issues of climate change, and why Barbados' Prime Minister herself has become perhaps the leading voice globally on all things climate. Climate change now has become the climate crisis because of countries like ours and voices like Prime Minister Motley's. And so, Mr. President, the International Maritime Organization, with whom Barbados has had a long-standing, well-established relationship, is the entity that is responsible for evolving what I think all of us who have been working in international transport for any period of time, evolving a considerable body of work around shipping. How shipping, Mr. President, is going to evolve in terms of cleaner fuels, how shipping is going to evolve in terms of regulatory management, disposal of waste. All of those are questions that the International Maritime Organization has been concerning itself, Mr. President. And as you know, recently Barbados would have hosted the Global Supply Chain Conference, and while here, the Director General of the IMO was here on island, and we had the opportunity to meet with him. And one of the things that we discussed in those meetings, Mr. President, was the fact that when he assumed office of the IMO, not only did he begin the process of looking at the work that the IMO was doing and what needed to be done moving forward, but also revamping the work of technical assistance that was being provided by the IMO to be able to allow countries to evolve their regulatory frameworks, their legislative frameworks, and their development infrastructure to be able to address the needs of the shipping industry, specifically as we spoke about issues relating to climate. And the legislation, Mr. President, therefore covers a range of these items. If we were to go through the legislation itself, Mr. President, is divided in parts. The legislation speaks about the prevention of air pollution, for example, in section part 3, from shipping activities. It covers, Mr. President, specifically for large-scale vessels, vessels of 400 gross tons and above, and the equivalent, therefore, is covered in 400 gross tons for vessels. Those will be the ones that are operating in and around Barbados' waters. I'm going to come back to part 4, which is the one I want to spend some time on. It goes on in part 5, Mr. President, to speak about the nomination of surveyors and certifying of certificates, emissions reductions for vessels, the fuel options and fuel compliance, the national level maritime energy governance, and so on. I want to focus attention today on 2 elements of the legislation, Mr. President, as captured in the legislation that we have here. The first one, Mr. President, speaks to, in part 7, fuel options and fuel compliance. Mr. President, I, as Minister of Energy, also happen to be the Minister with responsibility for the Barbados National Oil Company. And under the Barbados National Oil Company, Mr. President, the fuels that are imported into the country are done largely under the umbrella of BNOC, we call it BNOC. One of the things that we have become very proud of, Mr. President, is that Barbados has been determined by most of the providers across the region, but most specifically in the context of this legislation, by the shipping community to have the highest quality fuel in the region. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that ships, both cruise and cargo, oftentimes opt to have their bunkering services done here in Barbados, as opposed to many of the other jurisdictions in the region, largely because the quality of what we call our ultra-low sulfur diesel is spec higher than most other jurisdictions. That, Mr. President, is one of the things of which we are proud. When our teams from BNOC, Mr. President, spend time looking for suppliers of fuel products, one of the things that they're always troubled by, a lot of times, is that Barbados' specs are higher than most of our counterparts in the region. And what that means, Mr. President, is that oftentimes, when the ships come here, not only are they already looking for cleaner fuels, but that they are also understanding that as they transition their own equipment to be in compliance with IMO regulations, that Barbados is that hub. And for a country, Mr. President, that imports 90% of what it consumes through its ports, in particular, 90% of all goods come through the Bridgetown port, Mr. President, therefore on ships. It is important that as we look at our carbon emissions and our carbon footprint, that we integrate our productive sectors, our tradable sectors, in particular, the amount of goods that we import, we've already captured that at around 90%, with a regulatory regime that minimizes our carbon emissions and does not add to the challenges of climate and the climate crisis in particular. In addition, Mr. President, you know that there have been these YouTube videos that you have seen, or on social media from time to time, you will see these videos of ships offshore disposing of waste in a way that is perhaps not acceptable. Those regulations have already been introduced by the IMO over the last several years, and they are also captured in this legislation, Mr. President. It does speak about waste. In the Bridgetown port, Mr. President, and I believe you know that I was also chairman of the Bridgetown port for some time, the Bridgetown port has the responsibility to receive ships' waste. It has a responsibility to receive waste from the ships, and it has to be disposed of in situ. It cannot be removed from the Bridgetown port under our environmental rules and brought into the country into land-based sources of disposal. And so the port, the Bridgetown port, has in-house capacity to be able to dispose of that waste. But what is more important, Mr. President, is that historically, the port would have received the waste from the ships, but now, Mr. President, more and more ships have onboard incineration capacity, and therefore, more and more waste is being disposed of on board the ship with limited capacity for air pollution by using newer technologies, Mr. President, like pyrolysis and those other technologies that have evolved that allow for waste to be converted to energy on board the ships, and then the receiving country, like Barbados, portside, would be receiving only the ash where applicable, and then that is what is disposed, Mr. President. So these things have very practical implementation when you begin to look at what happens portside and what happens on board the ship. So the quality of fuels matter, the disposal of waste on board the ships matter, Mr. President, but also in this legislation in Part 4, it requires ships to do a number of things, including, Mr. President, under the MARPOL Annex 6, it requires ships to look not only at the quality of the fuel that they are receiving, but it requires them to keep bunkering notes, to keep detailed notes which capture that fuel quality, and to be in possession of those notes for a period of 3 years, so that you can always conduct an audit of what your fuel and your energy efficiency is, Mr. President. Local fuel suppliers are also going to be required to register with the Barbados Maritime Transport Administration and to submit annual declarations of compliance with the IMO set fuel oil requirements on fuel suppliers. And this is part of the requirement for us as a flag state to ensure that we are effectively monitoring and regulating local fuel suppliers as required by MARPOL 6. The one element that I want to focus on, as I mentioned here under Part 4, Mr. President, is that this legislation requires now ships to have an energy efficiency regulatory framework. What is that, Mr. President? What does that talk about? The energy efficiency regulatory framework includes a number of elements. One, it requires an energy efficient design index. And what is that? It is a measure that the IMO has imposed on vessels that requires the use of energy efficient equipment and energy efficient engines on new builds. When we were in the port, Mr. President, we would have an annual 5-year exercise in the first instance, and a longer range 10-year exercise, which looked at, for cruise in particular, what the industry was doing, where the industry was going. And usually in that assessment, we could see how many new ships in the cruise industry were on order, when they were set to take delivery, where they were likely to be deployed, and we could project outward what the Bridgetown Port's capacity was likely to be by cruise line based on new ships on order. You saw, Mr. President, very recently, just a few years ago, that Royal Caribbean would have commissioned its first LNG ship, and it was commissioned here in Barbados. And it was bunkered and provided the fuel here in Barbados through the Barbados National Oil Company, Mr. President. That is because Barbados has distinguished itself as a global leader, not just in climate, Mr. President, not just in the cruise in the tourism industry, but also, Mr. President, we have connected that leadership in practical ways to the productive sectors, in this instance, Mr. President, to the shipping industry. So the Energy Efficiency Design Index, Mr. President, is one of those elements which seeks to reduce the amount of pollution coming from new build ships. You also have, Mr. President, under that same framework, the index, it is a requirement, Mr. President, to ensure that it is reducing the greenhouse gases and that there is an actual calculation mechanism that allows for that. There's also, Mr. President, a ship energy efficiency management plan. That is one of the things that is required. All ships of 400 gross tons and above engaged in international voyages are required by the IMO to develop and keep on board a ship energy efficiency management plan in accordance with the IMO guidelines. This is specific to each ship. Mr. President, a cruise ship that has the capacity to carry 5,000 passengers, an Oasis class, an XL class, versus a cargo ship, they're all very different. And so the energy efficiency management plan must be made specific to each ship. And so the ship plan, Mr. President, is a requirement for ship owners and operators to manage operations and to improve their energy efficiency over time. It is an ongoing process, Mr. President, and you can see that there are already significant gains being realized. There's a requirement, Mr. President, also for fuel consumption and data reporting. The IMO now requires ships to collect and report ship fuel oil consumption data. This is going to be accompanied by a statement of compliance issued by the flag administration, whichever flag the country the ship is carrying. And in Barbados's case, if it is a flag state, a ship carrying Barbados's flag, it should then have that compliance certificate issued by the Barbados Maritime Transport Administration. That is going to be executed on by the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport. You then have an international energy efficiency certificate. And then, Mr. President, you also have specific elements in this section of the legislation, particularly all the way through in 41 to 43, which outlines the methodology to be used for surveying, verifying, and certifying the regime for ships as being compliant with the standards that we have just outlined, Mr. President. So those are the energy components that I have spoken about in Part 4. I have spoken also about the fuel options and fuel compliance requirements also. So you have fuel oil sampling, for example. At BNOC, one of the things that we are now in the process of doing is investing capacity in laboratory infrastructure at BNOC, at a terminal oil company, to be able to undertake testing right here in Barbados for fuel quality. Typically, you are able to get it done here, but only up to a certain level. We want to be able to ensure that as Barbados executes on its ambitions of becoming a logistics hub, and more vessels are coming to Barbados, that we have the capacity to test that fuel here on island. That is particularly important, not in the maritime sector so much, but on the aviation side, Mr. President, where aviation fuel must always be tested. So we will be building that capacity here in Barbados. In terms of the governance mechanisms that are being proposed in this legislation, Mr. President, they're all captured with regard underneath the umbrella of the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport. The Ministry of Tourism and International Transport will be responsible for the national level maritime energy governance. They will be responsible for the inspection regime. The Bridgetown Port will have responsibility as the port state control, and together, Mr. President, with all of the relevant agencies that are then meant to take responsibility, you will have the capacity being built for Barbados to be one of those countries that are compliant. Mr. President, also captured here will be a couple of things that we have already covered, and I want to make it simple for people to understand. Driving our cars, Mr. President, when driving our cars, you know, when you see somebody's car backfiring, and all of a sudden the smell of the car, and you see the white rings coming out from a car, this legislation as it relates to ships also includes exhaust gas cleaning systems operations requirements. And so at Part 11, it requires ships to meet those requirements where your exhaust is almost non-existent, and that there are prohibitions that are incorporated, in particular in clauses 100 through 106 of the legislation, Mr. President. That is captured here. I want, Mr. President, now to go to Part 12 of the legislation, where it talks about sustainable economic development initiatives. Mr. President, this morning, I was a little late, and I believe I've already apologized to the colleagues for arriving a little late. I was very pleased. I think everyone knows that when I joined the Senate and when I joined the government, I came to the government from the University of the West Indies, where I headed the commercial arm of the University of the West Indies. And I still remain very deeply embedded in the community from where I came. The University of the West Indies educated me both at undergraduate at the Mona level and the graduate level at the Cape Hill campus in partnership with other entities. And so, Mr. President, I remain committed to our regional institutions, and in particular to the University of the West Indies. So this morning I was pleased to join my colleagues at UWI for the launch of the International School for Development Justice. And while I was sitting there, Mr. President, and watching the University of the West Indies launch their first and their latest spin-off company, to be able to go into the space that this particular legislation and so many other things have gone before, an implementation mechanism for the Sustainable Development Goals for small island developing states. The University of the West Indies this morning launched an initiative under the International School for Development Justice, which is a partnership with all of the campuses, all 5 campuses of the UWI, to teach a series of master's courses in partnership with the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, the University of Glasgow in the UK, and funded by IDB Invest as the development partner. You can pursue master's degrees jointly issued by these institutions and the United Nations University as well in all of the areas relating to Sustainable Development Goals realization, in all the areas relating to climate justice, in all the areas relating to development of small island developing economies. And as I sat there this morning, I want to commend the University of the West Indies on a well thought out initiative, and in particular, Vice Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles, whose brainchild it was. I want to commend the University of the West Indies. As I look, Mr. President, at Part 11 of the legislation, where it spoke about sustainable development initiatives, I want to throw out the challenge to the University of the West Indies. The University of the West Indies has just, in a seminal moment, achieved a phenomenal accomplishment, and I'm incredibly proud of them. But I sit presently in the government of Barbados, in the Ministry of Energy and Business, and in that ministry, we see, and across Barbados, the work and the support of international development agencies supporting countries just like Barbados and in the Pacific and in the African region to achieve their development goals, their sustainable development goals. We have seen the development community all across the globe working with developing nations like ours to address the impact of the climate crisis. Barbados has been at the forefront of that. And I would welcome the University of the West Indies, through the International School for Development Justice, to be sitting in the center of the development conversation, providing policy-driven research on areas of priority interest to countries like ourselves that then can be acted on as part of our development agenda. The University of the West Indies and all of the other functional institutions of the Caribbean civilization, those that have been created by us and for us, like the Caribbean Development Bank, like all of the other entities that are here in the region, they have a central and a critical role to play in the implementation of our sustainable development objectives. They have a critical role to play in the policy advancement of our climate crisis interventions, Mr. President. And I welcome what the University of the West Indies has launched today as yet another opportunity of them putting to practical work, putting into practical service the tremendous intellectual prowess that the University of the West Indies has been garnering. As I close out, Mr. President, on this legislation, I wanted to ensure that I covered one remaining section in the legislation. I wanted, Mr. President, to speak specifically about penalties. I wanted to speak about penalties and the application of penalties in the event of breaches. The legislation includes, in Part 12, a series at sections 18, administrative penalties, notices around administrative penalties, and how those things can be challenged by a shipping company in the event that they are dissatisfied with what has been issued. There are general penalties, and then there are enforcement provisions. I know that one of my colleagues here always talks about enforcement. How are we going to enforce this, Mr. President? And what we have seen is that by the establishment of the Maritime Transport Governance Framework under the Ministry of International Transport, that the expectation is there will be the capacity vested in that agency, and we will see that evolving in time to come. I want, Mr. President, to commend this legislation to the Honourable Chamber. There are a series of schedules appended to the legislation which capture the various draft texts, which allow for you to see what the certificates would look like, what the energy efficiency certificate would look like, what the various certificates, all of them, would look like, Mr. President, so that there's no ambiguity about what is expected and what is going to be implemented, Mr. President. This is the bill before this Honourable Chamber, Mr. President. I know that we have supported in the past all of the elements relating to climate change and climate crisis that have been affecting our country. We have just seen, Mr. President, the passage of Hurricane Beryl. We've just had another hurricane affecting Bermuda, and we are still only in August. We still have all the way through to November to make our way. And therefore, Mr. President, the fact that the climate crisis is here and present with us and creating and presenting clear and present dangers by way of increased climate events is a fact that we must live with. But that it is also present, Mr. President, in areas relating to our maritime space, in particular a nation like Barbados that has 400 times its land space in its maritime space. This is a critical piece of legislation, and I'm hopeful that we can get the support of our honourable members in giving this legislation your nod today. And with these few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Senator Mallalieu. Senator Cummings, could you move that the bill be read a second
Mr.
time?
President, I beg to move that the bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much. Senator Mallalieu.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President. A few comments on this bill. First of all, sir, let me start by saying that I am not a climate change denier. I, like our Prime Minister and the Senator who has just led this on government business, I have seen the clear and present danger. I am one who is well aware of the overwhelming evidence that our human activity on this earth is affecting our climate. I see it in ways that perhaps others don't see it, because I manage to travel, and with my work and other things, I see places in this world where they could grow grapes before and make wine, and that's gone. The weather is too warm, it doesn't happen anymore. I see places where people could ski and enjoy recreation because they had snow, and there hasn't been snowfall now in many years. I see places where the rainfall just here in Barbados, I don't know, maybe it's me, it seems to be heavier, more concentrated, and then we see all of the hurricane activity and so on. I think there is overwhelming evidence, sir, for climate change. I think there's overwhelming evidence that our human activities have affected our climate that we live in, and urgent action is needed. So I wanted to start by saying that, because if you only listen perhaps to some other comments I might have, you might think that I am disagreeing with what is in this legislation, but I am not, sir. I want to be practical though, and I want to perhaps jump in where the Honourable Senator made a reference to Barbados's sea, our maritime space is 400 times bigger than our land space. Let me give you another reference point. We are 260,000 people, more or less, in Barbados, sir, out of 8.2 billion in this world today. 260,000 out of 8.2 billion. Sir, that is less than 4/100,000ths of the population of the world is in Barbados. That is 0.000031 of the population of the world lives in Barbados. But we bear the brunt of the climate change that has happened with many, many others of these billions of people that don't live here. But sir, when I travel, it's interesting some of the things I see. This year, and I start with this little story before I get to the substantive matters of some of the in the act. This year I had occasion for the first time to travel to Saudi Arabia, to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And I want to share with you what I saw there, sir. Sir, Saudi Arabia is a country that is the second largest producer of oil in the world. The second largest. I always thought they were the first. They produce 12.4 million barrels of oil per day. The United States of America produces more than that per day. That is 4.5 billion barrels of oil they're producing per day. 32 million people live in Saudi Arabia, sir. It's about 128 times the size of Barbados. When I was there, sir, I did not see one photovoltaic panel. Not one. Not on the ground or on the roof. I didn't see one electric vehicle. And you know what else I didn't see, sir? I didn't see one cloud in the sky either. Absolutely crystal clear for the week I was there. But not a PV panel in sight, sir. I say that because it really rocked me when I left there as to what could we possibly be doing with our 260,000 people in Barbados when there are countries like this who are air conditioning open spaces. You heard me correct, sir? open spaces with air conditioners that are being energized by fossil fuels somewhere else, producing carbon into the atmosphere, and they're spewing cold air into the... Because they can do it. They have, look at my note here, they have reserves of 266 billion gallons of oil. So to burn a little bit of oil to air condition an area is no consequence. But we in little Barbados, sir, we are doing all that we can, and our Prime Minister is leading this charge. And I echo the words of the Honourable Senator, that it is an honourable duty that our Prime Minister is doing in raising the awareness of the impacts of climate change on small island developing states like ourselves. But sir, we have to think very carefully, I believe, about what is the cost of many of these regulations that we are putting on ourselves. We need to be realistic about what we can afford and what difference it will make. I know we need to lead. But sir, if I give you an analogy maybe, so that, because when we talk about billions of barrels of oil and so on, I don't understand. I don't even know how much is in a barrel of oil. It's more than a can, I guess. It's a big barrel. But if I have a little water leak at home and my tap is dripping, and let's say it was dripping a little ounce per day, would I spend $100 to fix that tap? Chances are, sir, I wouldn't. You probably wouldn't recommend that I spend $100 to fix a tap that was just a little drip here and a little drip there. But if I knew that I only ever had one last gallon of water in this world to use, I might spend $100 to do it. And that is the urgency that we face with today, is that we are reaching the point with the temperature increasing that we have to spend everything that we can. But we did not cause this problem. Where are we getting this money from to solve some of this? So that is going to be at the core of my comments today. And what I would like to do is, I want to be clear, I have no opposition to this legislation, but I do have some questions, sir. And here are where these questions will come at. The obligations that this legislation places upon the ships that are plying their trade in our water are flagged, and they're over a certain size, 150 tons, I think is where it's at, are significant obligations that are placed on the ships, and it's significant obligations that are placed on us as a country. So the questions that I have would be, have we checked with the operators of the vessels and the vessel owners, the vessel companies that actually do business in our waters, that they can comply with this regulation? Because this is significant legislation that puts requirements on them. Have we checked with them? Now, I've heard the mention of the cruise ships. Yes, of course, these newer cruise ships that are being built to very high standards, but they're not the only ones who are in our waters. What about the feeder container ships? I believe one is Crawley, or is one of the brands, I believe. I don't want to cause any trouble, but I believe that there are many feeder ships that ply between the islands, carry containers and stuff like that, and they're over 150 tons. Have we checked with them that this doesn't affect them negatively, or that they have a plan to deal with it? What about the regular tankers that are coming to our island? The LPG tankers, the ones delivering fuel here? What about those cement transport ships down at the cement plant in the north? My question is, have we checked with the operators that they can comply with these regulations? Have they agreed that the implementation of this legislation will not effectively prevent them from doing business with us? Has the analysis been done as to how much the shipping costs will increase to Barbados under the requirements of this legislation? Go back to the point I made. At some point, you have to decide that you've got to repair that faucet because it is leaking. The question is, where is the money coming from? So if we agree that we have to do this, my question is, who is paying for it? Let's get back to the core of the matter. The obligations, like, for example, I think it is Article 15 where it starts in the legislation, and I have taken the time to read it. This is a long one, but I did take some time to read everything on it. The Article 15 speaks to obligations, or general obligations, And then later on, there are many, many articles with specific obligations are created. Those obligations, as I see it, really, sir, are threefold. There are obligations that are a cost to comply. There are obligations where there's a cost to monitor and enforce it. And there are obligations in this legislation throughout it where there's a cost to Barbados to provide facilities for the discharge of the various pollutants in our port. For example, Article 15, the obligation, and I will quote from it, 15.3 says, ozone-depleting substances carried on board vessels or platforms shall be discharged in appropriate reception facilities in accordance with Chapter 3 of MARPOL, Annex 6. I understand completely why we need to be on to that. My question is, who is funding the reception facility? Who is bearing that cost? How are we doing that if that doesn't exist today? How are we doing it? Articles 16 and 17, they lay out even more. And it is that cost that I am focused on. Because at the end of the day, it has been my experience that it is the final consumer who is going to pay these costs. It's the 260,000 souls in Barbados who are going to have to pay the cost of the obligations that we are signing up to, rightfully so, but this is a problem not of our making. What is the cost in Article 70? What is the cost of meeting the duties at the port? Article 73 and 74. 74, sir, especially gives obligations that after 6 months of when we pass this act, if it's passed today, as it likely would be, we have to have an internal energy audit. Who's paying for that to be done? It looks like a whole lot of people to me also is being created. So there's technical managers, port engineer, energy manager, energy management team, climate change coordinator. They're all listed in there. Perhaps they already exist, but maybe they're new people. Maybe it's new skills that we're going to hire. Because when I read some of the responsibilities, my gosh, the responsibility of the technical manager alone, which is covered in number 77, climate change coordination in the maritime sector, rapid assessment of ship emissions, energy audits, consultations, energy sustainability strategies, and it goes on. And I see more and more costs. Article 103 references a port waste reception facility, wash water testing. Who is doing that? Are we building a lab, sir? Is there a plan to build a lab here that we can actually test this water? How are we doing that? And perhaps all of these things have been thought of. Articles 105 and 106, residue generated by EGCS. EGCS is exhaust gas cleaning systems. So you burn harmful fuels in your engine, you filter it through some water, you take out the harmful stuff so that you don't kill the birds, but now you have some contaminated water on board your vessel. And when you come into the Barbados port, you have to discharge that, and we have to receive it. So you can't just throw that water now, which is contaminated, back into the ocean, because we will save the birds and we will kill the fish. And as the Honourable Senator, sir, said, these penalties are big for non-compliance with this, as it should be, because the consequences are big, $100,000 fines. But it still leaves me with a big unanswered question, is what are we going to do with all of this nasty discharge stuff when they bring it into our port? What's the plan? How much of it are we going to be storing, and for how long? So this is not a different question of what I've asked about the electric vehicles, of which I own and drive one now. But I asked this question when we brought about this legislation, and I still don't know that we have answered it. What do we do with the spent lithium-ion battery in that car? Because we're doing the right thing, maybe, in protecting the environment and not discharging the carbon emissions from the internal combustion engine. But we need to get rid of that battery at some point in time. And this matter is urgent for us in Barbados because we've had these cars 6, 7, 8 years. Their batteries have reached the end of their useful life. I don't want to go in my treks, as I do from time to time, walking through gullies in Barbados, which I enjoy doing, to find an electric vehicle battery just disposed there. with lithium ion, because I do not know what that will bring for us. So how will it be disposed? And this is all in an island, sir, where we have been agonizing, arguing, and even litigating for years on garbage disposal. It is a problem for us because we are so small, which we talked about before. We are only 166 square miles, 260,000 people competing for those spaces. Nobody wants a garbage dump next to them. Nobody wants an electricity plant next to them. Nobody wants a windmill next to them. It's a small place. We compete for these things. So, sir, I'm coming close to the end of what is an unusually long presentation for me. I know we want to be good global citizens, and I do as well. But we have limited resources, and we can't do everything. The amount of pollution that we generate is minuscule in comparison to our wealthy brothers and sisters in the industrial world. We need to choose carefully what we can do with the resources that we have. Not every mechanism is practical for us to implement. And we shouldn't have to bear the price for all of these mechanisms on our own. A good example, though, sir, where we have done very well is photovoltaic. The PV adoption in Barbados is significant, is really well, and all the government departments, all the government politicians, whoever wants to take credit for it should take credit for what they've done there. It makes sense for us in Barbados. Unfortunately, though, the lack of battery storage has now hamstringed us, or whatever the right word is. It's brought it to a halt. And I continue to be concerned that the failures in the process between FTC, Barbados Light and Power, interveners, some here, some not, it's harming all Barbadians. Our efforts in photovoltaic make really good sense for us as a country. It does reduce the carbon footprint, and for us in Barbados, it has a double impact. It reduces the cost of our imported fossil fuels into Barbados. So I do hope that we get past that impasse. I know a lot of work is being done on it, but I'm looking forward to the great news soon that all of the PV projects that have been announced and invested in are able to be brought online to the system. So, sir, I would just beg your indulgence. I want to stray into one area today which I normally do not go off topic, but I'm going to try to relate this to having good information and making good decisions based upon accurate information. And as I said earlier, we have accurate information, in my opinion, that climate change is of our own doing. But I'm very concerned in Barbados, sir, that we are allowing inaccurate information to be disseminated. And I want to give a specific reference to something that I heard on one of these call-in shows just after Kaduma. And this is the first time we've met since then. I heard the moderator say, "Let me read some submissions from the WhatsAppers." Now, I don't know, sir, if by saying that, you can then read whatever someone sends you. Because I thought that a radio station would have a responsibility to disseminate only accurate, reasonable information. And sir, what did I hear next? I heard a wild accusation that the developer at the Pierhead, not far from here, had in fact destroyed the screw dock. Others have heard it, sir, not only you and I, others heard it. And sir, it happened to be very interesting to me because for the first time in about 30 years, the day before on Kaduma Day, I was invited out on a small speedboat and I took a tour into the Careenage, which I had not done in 30 years. Come in the Careenage that way. We were looking at the damage from the storm and so on. And I saw with my own two eyes the screw dock. And I saw the screw dock was surrounded by hoarding, so as to protect it from what was going on around me. But on the other hand, I am hearing on the call-in show, the moderator use the words, let me read from a note from a WhatsApper, and makes the allegation against the developer that they've destroyed the screw dock. Sir, That we cannot allow. They are under a license, a broadcast license in Barbados. They have a responsibility not to disseminate it. Are we going to have, what do they call it in the US? They call them alternative facts. As far as I know, the only alternative fact my grandmother knew about was a lie. I can't say the first word. So, sir, I apologize to digress for a moment, but I wanted to make sure we understood the connection between making decisions on good information that we have. And I think that we need to look at that very carefully, because those shows seem to be coming a place where you can just say, well, I got this from somebody else. But what if I said today, well, you know, the leader of government business stole my lunch today and she is the thief? Am I allowed to say that, sir? If I sent that in as a WhatsApp, can you just read that? That's not reasonable, sir. We need to address things like that in our little Barbados. So, sir, let's get back to this particular piece of legislation. And all I'm asking, and I will wrap up now, sir, is that we consider the implications, the cost implications of enacting these measures. Has it really been studied? Is there a cost and benefit analysis that can justify as a country where we represent less than 3/100,000th of the world population? Can we afford the measures, that the obligations under here? And if we can't afford it as a country, I know we need to afford it as a world population. Who else is going to help us to pay to meet these obligations? Because we cannot put these obligations on our people when in fact those shipping companies are making huge gains in other places. The goods that they're shipping to Barbados from industrialized nations, they have made significant profits. The cost of the implementation of this cannot lie solely with us. And perhaps the government of Barbados has a plan as to how that can be offset. But frankly speaking, sir, I just need to understand the answers to these questions. Tell us what all the shipping companies have agreed to this. Tell us what this will really cost. Tell us who will pay the bill. Tell us how we are getting others to help us to foot this bill. So, sir, with those comments, I support what the bill goals are. It has obviously been prepared by technical people much more knowledgeable than me on these subjects. But as I have often said, and I bring the perspective of what does this mean when I go to the cash register at the supermarket, does this mean that I have to pay more because we signed up for this? And sir, with those few comments on this bill, I'm obliged to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Mallalieu. Any other speakers? Senator Dr. Munro-Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. I want to acknowledge the very good advocacy for climate change by Senator Mallalieu. I think he very much contextualized the impact for Barbados, the impact of climate change generally, and particularly his continued call of who pays really brings to the fore the tension that many of us, when I say many of us, many countries like ours have to face in this whole issue, dialogue, challenge of the climate crisis. Who pays? Senator Mallalieu talked about how we were, I can't remember the exact numbers, this is, I'm going to call it, proportion of the global population, small. But even when you look at our contribution to the GHG emissions, which is one of the biggest issues in relation to climate change, I actually went online, so this is again not information that I've gotten from any source that anybody else doesn't have privilege to, quoted Mr. President from an agency called Macro Trends, and this agency monitors GHG emissions from countries across the world. And it says that Barbados' greenhouse gas emissions for 2001 was 0.00%. Now, if you go down into the zeros, you will get some numbers, but it stopped there. And it indicated that that was down from 2020. We had a 1.46 decline, and then down again from 2019, where we had a 2.26 decline. So we contribute that, again, very small percentage of greenhouse gas emissions. But yet the impact, as indicated by Senator Mallalieu, is disproportionate because it's real big. And so the choice for us in terms of how do we address that impact, and the choices that we have to make in terms of how we address and what we address with the little resources that we have, is one of the biggest challenges, again, facing us as small island developing states in this climate crisis. And it is one, Mr. President, that is both local and global. And the answer of who pays, therefore, has to be both local and global as well. And this is one of the reasons why, again, Barbados' leadership of the Bridgetown Initiative has been so touted. Because we hear the discussion on the Bridgetown Initiative and we see the leadership of the Prime Minister, but then we don't often connect it, that it is intended to really answer and call to account those that contribute the most to the issue, and call to account the disparities in terms of who has to pay for addressing the impacts. And that is really the impetus for the Bridgetown Initiative. And its call for the reform of the international financial architecture is about exactly that. Who pays? How do we pay? And it is really calling for, Mr. President, for multilateral development banks to make finance, again, more affordable for developing countries. It's calling for new mechanisms of finance. It is calling as well for the mobilization of resources from the large private sector globally in order to be able to support developing countries to be able to respond. And that is also as well the context for initiatives like these in relation to, one, addressing it, but also as well that critical question of who will pay, Mr. President. Again, Senator Mallalieu talked about the immense profits. The statistics suggest that the global shipping industry for the first quarter only of 2024 recorded profits of some 5.4 million. And it is suggested that by 2050, the shipping industry...
So just for clarity,
Sorry.
which, I didn't hear, which, you said million, billion, what was
Oh, sorry.
Trillion?
No, I said million, but it's really billion. It's billion. 5.4 billion. I apologize, Mr.
Thank you
President.
very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. $5.4 billion for the first quarter of 2024. And the statistics also suggest that the shipping industry by 2050 will grow by some 50, I was like between 50 and 250%. And again, all of the metrics pointing to increased profitability. So you have an industry that is growing, but also an industry that contributes 3% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, 3%. In fact, there is a suggestion by one study that if the shipping industry was a country, it would be the 6th largest emitter, Mr. President, the 6th largest emitter. So the 6th largest emitter also as well, bringing in huge profits. But then the impact on the oceans, Mr. President, tremendous in terms of, even if we look at a basic accident of an oil spill, Mr. President, and what that means for the ocean. Damage to coral reefs, Mr. President. The exhaust, the waste, extremely large. But again, who pays for that cleanup and that damage? Mr. President, globally, under the Conference of Parties COP, and that is something, Mr. President, that process of that Conference of Parties is the space where countries globally negotiate around climate change. In 2015, there was an agreement by 197 countries on what is referred to as the Paris Agreement. And that Paris Agreement still frames the discussions on climate change and climate negotiations. So now, every year annually, countries gather, and this year will be COP29. And countries will again go and gather to be able to negotiate on issues related to climate change. But one of the critical areas that countries negotiate on under this Paris Agreement and under the conference and within the Conference of Parties is about climate finance. In fact, the Paris Agreement at Article 9 makes specific reference to the obligation of developed countries to provide resources to assist developing countries to be able to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. There was even an agreement, Mr. President, coming out of the COP process for developed countries to provide $100 billion in support for developing countries. And what happened, Mr. President? It was not delivered within the time frame that it was supposed to be delivered. And even now they're saying, yes, it wasn't delivered at that time, but we still deliver it, even though we can't necessarily count it, Mr. President. This year, within that frame of the COP, the Conference of Parties, one of the big negotiating planks will be what is called a new collective quantified goal. Again, that is setting the threshold, again, for what developing countries will provide for in relation to finance. What that will look like, how we will determine it, how will we measure it. And Mr. President, I'm saying all of this, again, to demonstrate, as was discussed before, that notion of who pays is not just one that we can respond to globally, but that one that we have to be able to advocate, locally, but one that we have to be able to advocate on globally. So that fight has to be buttressed as well, yes, by us making sure that we put in place the resources, because if we don't, it is not just about that $1 or $100 that we pay to fix that leaking, you know. Because we can do that and we can make that analogy very simply. But the knock-on effects over time of not responding to some of these challenges is so great down the generational line that very often it means then that we have to make the sacrifice and fix the leaking faucet. But Mr. President, I also want to remind the Honourable Chamber that this government has demonstrated leadership again in terms of innovative financing. And we've, Mr. President, when we debated the Blue-Green Bank, the resolution for the Blue-Green Bank, we talked about the fact that that was also an instrument for innovative financing to address the impacts, the crisis of climate change, and how do we finance our own transition. Mr. President, we've talked about before that Barbados was the first to issue disaster clauses. We talked about, Mr. President, the fact that we have entered into, again, one of the most innovative instruments with the Inter-American Development Bank and an NGO, that for nature swaps. And that therefore, we are trying as best as we can with the limited resources that we have in order to make sure, again, that we can finance what needs to be done without having an unnecessary burden on the population, but at the same time, calling developed countries to account for the damage that they are causing. And Mr. President, this is not only something that Barbados has to contend with. I've quoted in the context of small and developing states. So that globally there is a big discussion around, again, who pays and how do we pay. So that, for instance, in Brazil, just this year, Brazil, under the G20 framework, is suggesting that there should be a wealth tax, Mr. President. That we should tax those individuals with incomes of 1 billion and more. There's also a suggestion of a carbon tax to tax, again, the shipping, industry, the airline industry, in order as well to be able to bring in those resources to then be dispersed to developing countries. But again, Mr. President, there's always a balance, because we know that if we do that and we pay the taxes, what then happens? Already, it is noted that one airline has indicated that they will start to charge this year what they are calling a green tax. I think it as much as £24 on all outbound flights from the United Kingdom, in order then to fund the use of sustainable energy in its operations. So the recognition that change has to happen in relation to reducing those emissions, but then as well continually wanting to pass on cost into consumers while they are also still reaping profits within their businesses, Mr. President. But that is a challenge. That is the hard challenge that we face. But it is not a challenge that we can back down from or step back from, Mr. President, if we are to ensure, again, that we can protect the livelihoods, Mr. President, of our peoples over the long term. One of the key principles that the Bridgestone Initiative and also Barbados' advocacy within the COP process, and I would say as well that Barbados has been given leadership to the Conference of Parties process, again by our advocacy, is that notion of polluter pays. So we have the Bridgestone Initiative, which is about the climate finance, but we also are very, very strong in our advocacy that polluter pays. And that is why, Mr. President, we continually remind those that are involved in the COP process, again, of those articles under the Paris Agreement that speak to the fact that it is the responsibility of developed countries in order to be able to provide the resources. But the third principle as well, and again, this is within the context of the legislation that we are discussing here, the bill, is that it is not just government actions that should be counted when we speak to the climate crisis and GHG emissions, but also as well those of the private sector. And therefore, the urgency for the private sector and big private sector itself to also play its part in order to be able to reduce emissions and provide resources. And it is within that context that you see this move with the International Maritime Organization to be able to ensure, again, that the shipping industry contributes to that, so that they have set themselves a target of reducing emissions within the shipping industry in 2050 in a big and substantial way. And it is something that is to be supported, again, in the overall climate crisis, Mr. President. And again, well, it means, therefore, that there are some areas of compliance that we will have to be able to adhere to. We understand that there is a bigger picture in relation to that fight for the climate crisis. Mr. President, like I said, I'm not going to be long, and I just want to, the final point, again, about that challenge and contradiction that we always face, right? Because it's very easy sometimes to be able to look at the shipping industry, and I believe the leader of government business was also tying this, again, to the other productive sectors. Mr. President, we need the trade. We need the trade. The statistics again suggest that at any given moment, there are more than 50,000 ships are crossing the ocean. They say that there are 11 billion tons of goods traded internationally by sea every year. Every year. We need the trade. I don't know if we remember, because I think sometimes we forget the COVID context. When things were not moving and things were slow, Mr. President, there were deficiencies in things that we could go to the supermarket and get. Even now, again, because of the supply side constraints, there are things that we're not seeing on the shelves. So we need the ships to be able to move, Mr. President. We need them to be able to move because we depend on that trade. And therefore, again, it is that notion of how do we balance that movement, again, with the environmental and climate concerns. And the idea of having that tax that I spoke about is one element, but there's also a suggestion that we can also slow down the rate. So effectively that means that if a ship can make its travel within a week, that we slow it down, that they then make it in a week and a half. But that also as well has some level of repercussions. So that globally, there is an effort to be able to develop a number of solutions. One, to greening, as we would call it, the shipping industry, in order to make it more friendly as well, but also as well to make sure that the cost of doing so does not come back to the consumer, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I close and I give full support to this legislation, and again, Mr. President, this is not a piece of legislation that sometimes we see as quote-unquote sexy. The discussion around climate change often doesn't necessarily get the attention in the press and in the public domain that we would like it to, as much as it is so urgent and so pressing for us. But this piece of legislation provides one other pillar, again, in what we have to do, again, as small and developing states, to ensure that we maintain our livelihoods, our lives, within the context of the climate crisis. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chantal Munro-Knight. Senator Mr. Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too will be brief. Mr. President, I was very impressed by the focused attention which the leader of government business gives to this 167-page bill. And as I listened, I kept asking myself, who will pay? Because there are requirements in this bill to put in place significant infrastructure that guarantees compliance with what is required in the bill. Senator Mallalieu followed with excellent questions that put to rest most of the things I had to ask, and I was pleased about it. However, I've asked myself, if we are having a fenced-in area called the port, and toxic stuff must not leave the port, and we will dispose of it, how will we know, and the port is on land, they will not get back into the water? The port is on our land space, it's just fenced in. And it's right next to where we pump water for our desal plant. And we admit that we are going to be bringing into the port and disposing of in the port. I didn't hear anyone object to Dr. Mallalieu, Senator Mallalieu's suggestion that you will be washing out tanks and getting rid of toxic stuff in water in the port. We talked about the quality of our fuel and why ships want to purchase fuel here. But there's no guarantee that what they'll be burning before they come here will be of a similar quality. So the expectation is that if our quality is rated so highly, it is possible that what they might be burning might not be of the same quality. Or it might be the same quality or better. However, when the waste from those ships are discharged, what will we do with it? I don't know what the plans are, but I would like to believe that there will be exhaustive and extensive plans that will protect this little rock from leakage and leaching of those things into our water supply. Now, I have complained in this Parliament and in my place of work about our inability to properly manage our waste at the hospital. So I'm pleased, sir, that there's a plan to manage the waste in the port. I hope that similar attention will be given to how we manage our medical waste. Senator Mallalieu touched on the disposal of our green byproducts in terms of photovoltaics and batteries. I recently met an individual who was involved in the recycling of car batteries and the repair of car batteries. And I had one concern in the conversation, and it was, what do you do with the batteries that can't be recycled? I will not repeat in this parliament what happens to them, but they just sit. So it appears as though the anticipated 7 years has arrived, and we have not yet had any comprehensive plan that we have been made aware of what will happen to these dangerous byproducts. I hope, sir, that there's a plan and it's in motion, and the public will hear about it soon. Now, I happened to be on the internet late last night, and I saw something on Google that spoke to a multi-billion-dollar business plan for one country to sell green energy to another country via an undersea cable and a massive photovoltaic plant. Australia, according to this Google, whether it's true or not, and I hope I'm not spreading falsehood, will be in the future selling green energy to Singapore. And I thought, can you imagine that we have reached the stage in the world where one country will supply green energy to another worth billions of dollars, and we can't get our problem, little island with a population of a grain of sand compared to the others, sorted out. And we need to fix it. If we are going to be able to supply energy which is needed for everything at reasonable and sustainable cost, we need to fix that problem, Mr. President. Now, there was mention of the development on the Pierhead, something very close to my heart, sir. And I stood in this chamber and I asked the minister who is responsible for preservation of architectural, of archaeological heritage, about preserving, making sure that when the excavations were done, not on the screw-dock is protected, particularly on a place called the Barracoon. And whether those archaeologists will be on site to make sure that when the excavations were done, that the archaeological relics, including the skeletons of our ancestors, were not put in trucks and dumped in a quarry. There's been no response. There has been no official response, sir. We've had the disaster that happened at the archives, no fault to the minister, absolutely no fault. And I praise her for her openness, sir, about how she felt, because it was a tremendous loss. But I hope, sir, that the mistake that was made in the WhatsApp conversation is not a mistake being made and called in the wrong place. Sir, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. Senator Cummins, please wrap up.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I want to thank both the honourable senators who have spoken for their stellar contributions. First, I want to perhaps respond to the joint conversation around the polluter pays, and I believe that Senator Dr. the Honourable Chantal Munro-Knight in her contribution spoke about the fact that it is a generally accepted principle in climate debates that the polluter pays. However, specifically then, as it relates to maritime, there has been a significant body of work done on the implications of the MARPOL regimes, the IMO conventions overall on the shipping industry. And there has been a discussion that I can see that has gone as far back as 2006, if not even before, as to when the respective MARPOL conventions would come into effect, what time ships would be given to be able to achieve compliance, what kinds of timelines they would be able to have the benefit of to be able to procure the financing for the purpose of retrofitting existing ships, but also how you would go about financing new ships that will meet the requirements and ensuring that those things are aligned. That has very much been a global conversation under the IMO and in the broader shipping industry, and I can tell you, at the time that I was Minister with responsibility for international transport, at the time, I don't know, actually no, it was at the time I was chairman of the port. I took the opportunity, and I believe it was the first time Barbados had ever done it, to fly to Miami to meet with the Florida Ship Owners Associations. All of the major ships that provide cargo services to Barbados, and then as you quite rightly pointed out, Senator Mallalieu pointed out, the feeder vessels that go and take from transshipment points into smaller ports, we met with them as far back as the time I was chairman of the port. I left being chairman of the port in July of 2022. Around not just the suite of legislation that needed to be done, but of course the broader relationship with Barbados as a logistics hub to be able to shore up the business relationships between us and them. I am confident that that relationship has continued, Mr. President, with my successor. And so I can only say, Mr. President, and give Senator Mallalieu the assurance that all consultations have been held under the umbrella globally of the IMO, who is responsible for all of the jurisdictions that are members and the ship owners, and that Barbados ourselves, we have been engaging with the relevant partners, both in the cruise and in the shipping industry. But what I am confident about, Mr. President, is that notwithstanding the adjustment and the normal transitional challenges that any industry faces as they adjust to these kinds of regulations, that there has been a strong commitment to making these changes, Mr. President. On the matter of disposal of waste in the Bridgetown port in particular, there have been two approaches, Mr. President, that they have used in the port. One, typically you will have food waste and that kind of waste coming off of a vessel, and they would come on the pallets, and you would have to dispose of the pallets and just regular waste that is non-toxic. And you have seen, especially if you're driving along the Spring Garden Highway sometimes, and it's always done in collaboration with the Barbados Fire Service and the meteorological office, so you know where the winds are blowing. No ships are in port. It seems as though it's close, but it really is the opposite direction. The winds are blowing offshore and the fire service is there. It is a controlled burn, and they have what they call open hearth burning of that kind of like wood and paper type waste that may come off of the vessels, but all other waste is then put into the incinerator. During the time that I was there, we had a discussion at the time around whether or not we would introduce a waste to energy facility using pyrolysis, and the Inter-American Development Bank's investment arm did a pyrolysis. It really just takes the waste, it disposes of it, converts it to a kind of gas, and then creates energy on the other side. But it was very proprietary and very new technology, and the determination was made that that was not the best option. As a result, they have gone with incinerating capacity. I believe that project is underway in the Bridgetown port to be able to ensure that we can dispose of waste. However, that being said, I do still want to revert to the point that the majority of the larger cruise vessels that come to Barbados, in particular, those are the ones that would dispose of waste, they have on board incineration capacity, and the amount of waste that Barbados takes from vessels has been considerably reduced over the years as they have used their own onboard facilities. And I want to give the members of the Honourable the Senate the assurance, as I do for members of the public, that every possible regulatory regime is in place to ensure safe disposal of all waste products. You have present in the port the Environmental Protection Department, who has a responsibility to deal with certain matters, and you also have, Mr. President, the Ministry of Health, Port State Health Control, and they, together with all the regulatory entities, take full responsibility for ensuring that what waste does come on shore is disposed of in compliance with the regulatory standards. I want also, Mr. President, to respond to the query that was raised around disposal of used battery type equipment. It is a solid question, and under the Ministry of Environment, there is an entire process and a paper being developed on a circular economy. And what does that mean? A circular economy meaning simply that you're reusing waste products in a way that is not detrimental to the environment. And so the expectation is that both from the Ministry of Energy side, both from lithium-ion batteries and old PV panels, for example, how they are disposed of is a part of that policy through the Ministry of the Environment. There are also, however, Mr. President, technologies which are evolving, in particular as it relates to batteries, where when they reach the end of their life cycle, which could be between 7 to 10 years, we're even now seeing 10 stretching to 15 years in a life cycle, that they can be repurposed, shipped offshore, repurposed and brought back onshore and used for a different purpose. I know one company right now, Mr. President, that has taken an old car battery and is using that battery to power their offices. They have repurposed it and it has been used in a different way. And so I want to give the assurance that even in those areas where you're having literally reduce, reuse and recycle, that has also been applied, being applied even to the energy sector. So the final thing that I want to respond to is the cost. Mr. President, the regime for payment is a global regime. The fuel prices for the fuel costs, for example, are you getting better quality in Barbados versus in another jurisdiction? The standards are meant to be at a baseline equivalent across all jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions simply have a lower standard than others. Barbados has maintained, independent of regulations such as these, a higher standard for, there are some jurisdictions from which we cannot procure products, Mr. President, because they don't meet our specs. And so the expectation is that the standards set by the IMO will be met by all vessels, but that they will then choose where they are able to meet that standard, if it is in Puerto Rico in the Northern Caribbean, if it is in Antigua in the Northern Caribbean, or if it is in Barbados in the Southern or the Deep Southern Caribbean, based on what the standards need to be. But that is where Barbados needs to position itself to make sure that the choice is always made that it is Barbados. And I want to thank Senator Dr. the Honourable Chantal Munro-Knight for connecting the conversation as well to the important refinancing conversation that is happening globally around the Bridgetown Initiative and how we're able to finance transitions in the maritime industry such as these. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill is now read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that you do not leave the chair and that the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Senate is now in committee.
Acting Deputy President, may we take the bill in parts? Part 1, clauses 1 through 8.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 through 8 do not stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 to 8 do stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 9 and 10.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 2, clauses 9 and 10 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 9 and 10 do stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 11 to 30.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 11 through 30 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 11 to 30 do stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 31 to 42.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 4, clauses 31 to 42 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 31 to 44 stand part.
42.
I'm sorry, clauses 31 to 42 stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 43 and 44.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 43 and 44 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 43 and 44 stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 6, clauses 45 to 55.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 6, clauses 45 through 55 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 6, clauses 45 to 55 stand part. Do all those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 7, clauses 56 to 68.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 7, clauses 56 to 68 do not stand part.
The question is that Part 7, clauses 56 to 68 stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 8, clauses 69 to 82.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 8, clauses 69 to 82 do not stand part.
The question is that Part 8, clauses 69 to 82 stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 9, clauses 83 to 89.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 9, clauses 83 to 89 do not stand part.
The question is that Part 9, clauses 83 to 89 stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 10, clauses 90 to 96.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 10, clauses 90 to 96 stand part.
The question is that Part 10, clauses 90 to 96 stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 11, clauses 97 to 109.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 11, Clauses 97 through 109 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 11, clauses 97 to 109 stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 12, clauses 110 to 133.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Part 12, Clauses 110 through 133 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 12, clauses 110 to 133 stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The first to the seventh schedules.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the first and the second schedules be the first and the second schedules to the bill.
The question is that the first and second schedules be the first and second schedules to the bill.
Seven.
The first
To the seventh.
to the seventh, I'm sorry, the first to the seventh schedule be the first to seventh schedules to the bill. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The 8th to the 13th schedule.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the 8th to the 13th schedule be the 8th to the 13th schedule to the bill.
The question is that the 8th to the 13th schedules be the 8th to the 13th schedules to the bill. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Report.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passage of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will those all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Do those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Marine Transport Emissions Control Act 2024.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Marine Transport Emissions Control Act 2024. Those honourable senators in favour please say aye. Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 5, sir. Order number 5, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of the resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, vesting in the National Housing Corporation of parcel of land, the property estate situate at Pilgrim Place in the parish of Christchurch in this island, and more particularly described in the schedule to the resolution for housing development.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I believe that I've lost count of the number of these bills that we have brought to this honourable chamber in fulfilment of the government's commitment to provide housing solutions for Barbadians. This resolution before the Honourable Chamber is in keeping with that objective. And on this occasion, Mr. President, it looks at the site of the old St. Bartholomew's Girls' School at Pilgrim Place in Christchurch and the vesting of that site into the National Housing Corporation for the purpose of housing development. Mr. President, the land at that area is adjudged to be in the area in the approximately 8.150.9 square meters, approximately 2.1 acres, and also, Mr. President, to have this space, as a consequence, Mr. President, passed over to the National Housing Corporation so that they can undertake and continue the important work that they have already started to provide housing solutions to Barbados. The resolution is before the Honourable Chamber, Mr. President. Further housing solutions. The resolution is before the Honourable Chamber. Mr. President, we are aware of the government's objective already. We've talked about the number of houses that have already started, those that are meant to be built, and I don't believe that I need to preach to the already converted in this Honourable Chamber, and so I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Any speakers? There being none, the question is that this resolution do not pass. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This resolution for the vesting of lands at Pilgrim Place in the National Housing Corporation is therefore now passed. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I want to thank the honourable members of the Senate for their participation today. This being the end of government business for today, I beg to move that the Senate be adjourned sine die.
Before I place the question, just want to make note that the Honourable House of Assembly has been adjourned until mid-September, I believe September 17th. And it therefore means that the Honourable Senate, barring any national emergency which will require both houses to return, will not meet until sometime after September 17th. And just to remind that the break is not so much a matter of members of either chamber getting time off, but we have a small staff that works hard to facilitate the work of two chambers, and the breaks in parliamentary meetings of the two houses does facilitate the taking of vacation leave, especially by our clerks and deputy clerks and senior folks, all staff. I want to say thanks to them and wish them certainly a happy break. So I want to thank you members for facilitating our meetings during the last several weeks. There's been much activity, and I wish you a pleasant break. I look forward to seeing you when you return recharged and refreshed and ready and rearing for the sprint towards the end of the year. The question is that the Honourable Senate do now adjourn sine die. Will those honourable members in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Senate therefore is adjourned sine die.